Shoprite has been fined 1 million rands for reckless lending. The competition tribunal had found that the retailer had entered into credit agreements with consumers without reasonably assessing the consumer ability to afford the loans. The tribunal found Shoprite to be in contravention of the National Credit Act when it took into account unverified income of another person, such as a spouse, when granting a loan. In addition to the fine, the tribunal has also ordered Shoprite to appoint a debt counsellor at its own cost to assess the standing of over-indebted customers. We have the Manager of Investigations and Enforcement at the National Credit Regulator, Jacqueline Peters, on the phone line. Good morning to you, Ms. Peters. Thank you so much for joining us. Just talk us through what exactly it is that Shoprite did in contravening the Act and how it's being fined.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. This investigation emanated, or this referral emanated after the National Credit Regulator has done an investigation into the lending practices of Shoprite. What we had found was that their affordability assessment mechanism that they were applying was not objective and reasonable or fair, and that it resulted in consumers being extended credit when they could not necessarily afford it. One of the examples was obviously taking into account unverified income. Other examples was not taking into account certain credit bureau data. And so what we found is that we believe that this is a very important judgment. The lending space has changed significantly over the last period with the affordability assessment regulations coming into effect. And this has clarified a lot of the requirements that are needed when doing an affordability assessment. And I think this judgment will just take it further and ensure that there are no grey areas. It's important for people to understand that we need credit extended to consumers in a responsible manner, specifically in this climate where this economic climate where consumers are finding themselves overextended. And we would obviously say that this will not be the last of the kind, this kind of investigation and referral by the regulator, but urge credit providers to act in a fair, responsible manner.
And, once an organization such as Shoprite in this particular case has actually registered itself and is approved as a credit provider, is there a way that they are monitored on a periodic basis to ensure that they actually still are complying? You mentioned that indeed the credit and lending space has evolved over the years, but is there some kind of a mechanism to ensure that they still are complying with the standards and practices?
There are various mechanisms. So the National Credit Act provides powers to the National Credit Regulator to, one, deal with complaints. So we would deal with complaints on a case-by-case basis, and that would obviously give you an indication of what's happening on the ground. The other mechanism that's available is to do compliance monitoring checks. So they would have to submit their compliance reports to us on an annual basis. And then obviously when there is a suspicion that there's something systemically wrong, we would then have a look at the business practices and launch a formal investigation. So there's different tiers and mechanisms that the regulator uses to assess the lending space.
And if you are able to share this information with us, what actually triggered the investigation into Shoprite's lending practices?
Well, I think the regulator had obviously formed a reasonable suspicion that something was happening, and we had to appoint an investigator to look into it. So it was really based on information that we had come across, and we had thought to take a closer look.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the ground report. That was the Manager of the Investigations and Enforcement at the National Credit Regulator, Jacqueline Peters, just talking to us regarding Shoprite's unorthodox lending practices and the fine that Shoprite now has to pay.